Good morning and good evening, well, good morning, good afternoon to those who are joining us today for our webinar. On behalf of the Commission on Advising Student Athletes, I would like to welcome you to this presentation on advising student athletes. Today with us we have two great presenters, Karen Schipple from Chicago State University and Adrian Woodray from Marquette University, who will be talking on the topic of advising student athletes. And at this time, I'd like the presenters to introduce themselves and give a little bit of background on who they are.
Good morning. Good morning if you're on the West Coast. Good afternoon for the rest of us. I'm Karen Schipple. I am the Associate Athletic Director for Academic Services and Senior Women's Administrator at Chicago State University. I have been doing athletic academic advising for probably close to 25 years with stops at Northern Illinois, Maryland, Ole Miss along the way, and excited to be here today to present this webinar to all of you.
Hi, I'm Adrian Ridgway from Marquette University. I'm currently the Associate Athletic Director for Academic Support Services for our student athletes here. I'm also the past chair of the NCAA NACADA Advisory Board, and I've been in college athletics for 14 years. I want to welcome you to the Advising Student Athletes webinar. So we appreciate that you're joining us today for this hour-long presentation. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the diverse group of professionals who are joining us and participating on the webinar today. So that you know, there are those who have advising student athletes as the sole job responsibility, but also we have a number of people who student athletes and student athlete advising is only a small part of their advising caseload. In addition, there are those who are representing two-year colleges as well as those with four-year school experience. And lastly, we have a group today that represents a wide range of levels of athletic competition, from the junior college participation level all the way to NCAA Division I level. For the purpose of this webinar, the content will focus primarily on NCAA student athlete population, specifically on the Division I student athletes. We recognize that this presentation is not by any means inclusive of every type of institution or every student athlete experience. But from it, we do hope that you're able to take something and apply it to your campus and your specific role advising student athletes. Briefly, let's review the learning objectives. The first objective is gaining familiarity with the intercollegiate athletics environment and then the student athlete experience. We want you from this webinar to think critically about some of the issues that we present that impact some of the special populations of student athletes. And then we want you to gain an understanding of the complexity of some of the NCAA governance, the rules and the regulations that apply to student athletes and their academic success. And then lastly, we want you to obtain some best practices knowledge that you think might enhance your professional practice as you work in advising student athletes. So why play college sports? Intercollegiate sports has been part of higher education for a very long time. Since the very first intercollegiate football game in American history between Rutgers and Princeton, the idea of student athletes has always existed. Over the years, especially in recent years, college sports have received a number of negative attention, from the pay-to-play debate all the way to some of the high-profile academic scandals. There has been a question kind of raised as why are students participating in college sports and why do they still decide to do so in modern times? Well, the NCAA has done extensive research on this topic and they've surveyed student athletes and they've discovered some of the following reasons as to why student athletes still play college sports. First, college athletics is a great way to get a college education. In our society today, we know that with the college education being so important and the value of a degree being so great, for many students, playing a college sport is what grants them access to a degree. Next, academic success. While much of the attention has kind of been placed on some of the negative aspects of college sports, it is important to recognize that the academic success of student athletes is great. Overall, NCAA student athletes graduate at a higher rate than the general student population. In addition, despite what you hear sometimes about student athletes leaving college early and them not finishing their degrees, nearly 13,000 student athletes have returned to campuses to complete their degree in the last decade after they finished their eligibility. Scholarships. In a time with very, very high tuition rates, participation in college sports is an excellent opportunity to receive a scholarship. More than 150,000 college athletes receive $2.7 billion in athletic scholarships each year from NCAA member institutions. Elite training opportunities. So through intercollegiate athletics, student athletes have regular access to some top-notch coaching, training, and equipment. Some of these resources that are provided to student athletes would typically cost Olympians thousands of dollars per year. So the training opportunities that student athletes have are great. For example, recently, University of Oregon built a $68 million athletic facility. It features some amazing things, such as a track that measures your speed, your power, your foot placement, or hydrotherapy pools. Some of these things are not even available to some of our most elite athletes, but they are available to student athletes. And then exposure and experiences. Intercollegiate athletics and the grants student athletes a wonderful opportunity to travel across the country, whether it be for regular season games or it might even be for a foreign tour. These experiences for some student athletes really do open a lot of great doors. And then lastly, the student athlete experience offers great preparation for life. Increasingly in the business world, businesses are focusing more on creating team environments with employees. By competing in college athletics, student athletes learn a lot of the skills such as leadership, time management, and how to work within a team environment towards a common goal. And you have companies today intentionally recruiting student athletes because of the skills that they bring to an organization. For example, I think during the NCAA tournament, you often see Enterprise Rent-A-Car as an advertiser. Enterprise Rent-A-Car is a company who are looking to actively often recruit student athletes for employment. So a little bit about the student athlete experience. As I stated earlier, for the purpose of this webinar, we're focusing primarily on NCAA Division I sports, largely because of our own personal backgrounds and experience at this level. However, it is important to note the rich diversity that exists in the student athlete experience. So if you look at this slide, we're representing some diversity in institution types. So it might be public versus private, HBCUs, Hispanic serving institution, or primarily white institutions, low resource institutions versus some of our Power 5 conference schools, and then 2-year versus 4-year institutions. We do have represented here the NCAA Division I, II, and III. The variations sometimes between these divisions are based mostly on sports sponsorship, participation requirements, and then financial aid or scholarship awards, and then the philosophy behind the level. For example, Division III places greater emphasis on the value of competing in sports and less on generating revenue or creating events for entertainment. We also have on here the symbols for NAIA and NJCAA. The NAIA is the governing body of some of the smaller athletic programs that are dedicated to character-driven athletics. And then the NJCAA is the governing body of 2-year athletics. Schools that fall both under NAIA and NJCAA, both are institutions or conferences that do offer athletic scholarships. There's pros and cons to each institutional type and each athletic participation level. So a student kind of has to determine what experience they're looking for and then what experience best suits their priorities and aspirations. Despite the differences between institutions and playing levels, the student athletes do experience sometimes the same struggles, and those struggles might be universal. Regardless of their experience, like time management often is an issue even for some of the best students, or sometimes students feel some levels of uncertainty in 3 areas specifically. Personal uncertainty, so uncertainty about their ability to balance school, work, and sports, or social uncertainty, some uncertainty related to like, who are my real friends? And then some future uncertainty. Uncertainties such as, what am I going to do after college? What do I do once my sport is done? The student athlete experience is also important for us to think about how college affects student athletes. Preparation in college and university athletic programs can impact the student in profound ways. First, involvement in college sports can impact the academic outcomes of student athletes. Research tells us that student athletes academically excel at levels higher than the non-student athlete student on campus. However, it is important to note that while students graduate at higher rates in overall comparison to the student population, some of our student athletes in revenue-producing sports, such as football or basketball, do have graduation rates that are lower or below average levels. From a student engagement perspective, student athletes are engaged in educational activities as much as other students, and they experience academic challenges on similar levels to the non-athlete peers. Lastly, we know that athletic participation has a strong impact on the psychosocial and cognitive development of student athletes. You'll see a notation on the bottom of this slide referencing the Hamilton Howard article. Student athletes struggle sometimes with identity formation, learning processes, and communication skills, especially those who compete in some of the high-profile intercollegiate sports. Sports can negatively impact some of their development in those areas. In addition, campus culture can play a major influence on a student athlete's identity related to their academic success. Negative perceptions by faculty and sometimes students on campus, such as that negative perception sometimes that we hear as student athletes as the dumb jock, or other disparaging comments about a student athlete's academic ability, can influence their own views of themselves, thus influencing their academic success. It's our responsibility as advisors to take every opportunity possible to both challenge and support student athletes on their developmental journey. Student athletes need to understand that we care about their holistic development, both cognitive, psychosocial, and their athletic. And then the emphasis only on their athletic domain can negatively influence the other two, thus perpetuating the dumb jock mentality. As an advisor, it's important to know and understand that the student athlete experience is complex, and some of the developmental issues are unique to certain special populations of student athletes. While various institution types support athletic participation opportunities, such as HBCUs or Hispanic serving institutions, the vast majority of our minority student athletes compete at predominantly white institutions. In college athletics, the issues that minority students face most is social isolation. Much of this is the result of student athletes congregating with their teammates or other student athletes of the same racial or ethnic identity. Therefore, it makes it kind of difficult sometimes for these students to familiarize themselves with the campus environment at large. These students often then are the ones who we see as advisors who are hesitant to sometimes engage with their advisor or with faculty members, and sometimes the lack of engagement then makes it difficult for them to communicate and build in the necessary relationships that enhance their academic development. Another special group to consider on campuses are the female student athletes. Since the passing of the Equal Rights Amendment Act of 1972, otherwise known as Title IX, the number of women participating in sports has greatly increased. There are more than 463,000 student athletes competing for NCAA sports, and approximately half, about 200,000 of these, are women. So despite some of the inequities that we still see sometimes between men's and women's sports programs, female student athletes in higher education are overall faring very well. The grade point average and the graduation rates of female student athletes are among some of the highest of anyone attending college. We also have to think about some of our other special populations in our student athlete diversity. While at many institutions, the student athlete population is known to be a pretty diverse group of students on campus, diversity related to sexual orientation often goes unaddressed or sometimes is met with discomfort, some tension, and a little apprehension. Advisors, it's important that we assume that there are LGBTQA students part of your student athlete population, even when they're not self-identifying. And because of this, we should know what the resources are available at your school to support LGBTQA students. The NCAA and then the NCAA Champions of Respect page on the NCAA website offers an excellent resource to educate you as a professional, but then also to help you as a professional foster a climate of inclusivity on your campus. Participating in college athletics are also students who represent a wide range of learners with varying academic skills and abilities. A term that's often used among us in athletics, but then also working with college students, is the term at risk. At-risk students in general may be a student with a documented learning disability, or they may be identified as severely underprepared for the rigors of college. Or sometimes they simply lack the motivation to succeed in college. Student athletes sometimes fall into a special category of at-risk because they've developed some type of behavioral or psychological issue that might be linked to their sport participation or maybe not, such as maybe an eating disorder or depression. So when working with these students, it's important to know where some of their academic deficiencies are coming from, so that when we're labeling them at risk, we also know what are the appropriate resources to connect them with, or what is the appropriate plan to develop to support them. So it may be a disability services referral, it may be a counseling center referral, or it might be something as simple as helping them with time management. But it is important to know where some of their deficiencies are stemming from. Another special population to consider are international students. International student athletes present a very unique population on college campuses. Research tells us that it is very important to consider issues such as socialization, cultural difference, language barriers, staying connected to family, the financial burdens that sometimes international students take on, and just to really get an understanding of how college is taught in the United States. Sometimes it's just an issue for international students. It's very important that advisors work hard to create a personal connection with international students, and it's important to talk to them about the resources that are available on your campus for international students. For example, here on our campus, we have an Office of International Students and International Education. This is a great resource for us to point student athletes in that direction if they're struggling with an issue related to them being an international student. There are many other unique subpopulations of student athletes, but regardless of the group, it's important to understand that each student individually has unique aspects, and that sometimes their specialized identity in the context of their student success has to be considered. The best practices portion of this presentation is going to be divided into 3 C's. We like to call them competence, communication, and collaboration. We felt that these 3 concepts are critical elements for any advisor who's working with student athletes to add to their toolbox to better equip them to work and advise student athletes. To begin our best practices discussion, I'm going to turn it over to Karen, who's going to talk about the important competencies for advisors when working with student athletes. Karen?
Thanks, Adrienne. I think that obviously there's a lot of diversity, a lot of things you need to know just about student athletes in general, but these 3 C's are super important in making sure advising for student athletes is successful. So we're going to start with competency. Competency for advisors working with student athletes starts with knowing the NCAA continuing eligibility rules. They can appear to be really complex and nuanced, and each division has its own set of rules. For this particular webinar, I'm going to speak to the Division I rules. In the resources included with this webinar, you'll find a reference sheet for these rules that you might find helpful in your advising. I would note for those of you that may not be Division I on this webinar and you want further information after the webinar, we can provide that as well, so just please send us an email and we'll get that to you. All right, so NCAA Division I rules and regulations. In the manual, in the NCAA manual, this is Bylaw 14. Student athletes, first and foremost, must be enrolled full-time with very few exceptions. They need to be 12 hours each semester, each term, unless they're in their final credits needed for graduation. PTD. PTD is what's known as progress towards degree, and we're going to break that down into some sub-rules here, the first one being 40-60-80. 40-60-80 is what's known as the percent of degree rule. It's important that you're tracking always that the students are taking classes that apply towards their degree, and that's how we figure out the percent of the degree. So starting in the 5th semester, which is typically the junior year, 40% of the degree is required to be completed for a student athlete to be eligible. What I mean by that is if you are an engineering major, that means 40% of your engineering degree must be done. So if you're an engineering major who's got a bunch of accounting classes, you might have a percent of degree rule. Starting the 7th semester, 60% of degree is required. Again, those must be degree applicable hours. They have to apply to the degree. Starting the 9th semester, 80% of the degree is required. As you can see, the 40, 60, 80, that continues to increase because the NCAA wants to make sure that student athletes are making that progress towards graduation. The 18 24-hour rule. In general, student athletes must pass 18 hours between their fall and spring semester to be eligible the next term. In the case of freshmen, in the first year, freshmen must pass 24 hours in their first year from fall to fall, but they have to make sure they maintain that 18 fall and spring. The 6-hour rule is in addition to the 18 24-hour rule, and student athletes must complete a minimum of 6 degree applicable hours in order to maintain eligibility in the subsequent semesters. Moving on to major declaration. This is important. As I mentioned, the fact that you must be in degree applicable hours. So anything that you're taking has to match the major. Student athletes are required by their junior year or their 5th semester full-time enrollment to actually declare a major. So first 2 years, it's okay to be undecided, and as we all know, sometimes student athletes are undecided, but by their junior year, you really should know which direction they're heading, and so student athletes are required to declare a major at that point. It's also important to note that for majors that require options and minors and concentrations and emphasis on your campus, if those are not formally required as part of the degree and they're not formally declared to satisfy the degree, then those would not count as being degree applicable. So in other words, anything that is not required does not count. It's very important to understand that concept. Student athletes really don't have the option sometimes of taking things that don't count towards their degree. Or in fact, they may not have the option to do minors and other concentrations if they have to make sure that their eligibility requirements are being met. GPA is probably the most common one we think of. Everybody thinks, student athlete has to make sure they're making their GPA, and certainly they do. The GPA rule is sometimes referred to as the 90-95 rule. Starting the 5th semester, again, the junior year, 95% of the GPA is required, so a 1.9. Starting the 7th semester and thereafter, 100% of the GPA is required, which is normally a 2.0. There are some institutions that a 2.0 is higher than a 2.0 that is required for graduation. So if your institution's GPA is higher than the NCAA requirement, you may need to go with that requirement as opposed to a 2.0. On top of the NCAA rules, the NCAA has some other data that they collect to see how student athletes are doing academically. Those fall under the NCAA's APP, or Academic Performance Program. The Academic Performance Program is a result of an April 2002 Board of Directors resolution. The NCAA Board of Directors wanted a system of incentives and disincentives to be developed that reward teams that do well academically and to penalize those teams that did not do well academically. That really is putting the student part first in the student athlete. So any NCAA school that sponsors a Division I sport is subject to APP. You don't have to be a Division I school, you just have to sponsor a Division I program. So there are Division II and Division III programs that are subject to APP. The APP, as you'll see above, is actually 2 different rates of measurement. One is the APR and the second is the GSR. So let's start with the GSR. The GSR is an annual rate. It is a real-time rate that is also a 4-year rolling rate that considers the eligibility and the retention of student athletes from term to term. The APR formula awards 2 points each term for each student athlete who meet the eligibility and retention standards. So there's always an E point and there's always an R point. E meaning academically eligible and R meaning retained to the institution. If you hear the term 0 for 2, that refers to a student athlete who was both not eligible and not retained for the next academic term. Those, of course, are the ones we all want to avoid. So the formula, as complex as it may seem, is actually fairly simple. You take the number of E points, eligibility points, you add those with the R points, so we do that for everyone on the entire team for the entire year. and then you take that and divide that by the total points for everyone for the team. You multiply that by 1,000, and that's how you get your APR number. 1,000 would be perfect. The NCAA benchmark currently is a 930. Teams have to meet this benchmark in order to avoid penalties and disincentives, anything from loss of scholarships to inability to compete in postseason, etc. Also, schools who don't meet the benchmarks have to submit improvement plans to the NCAA outlining steps that they will take to rectify the 930. As advisors, campus advisors, you may be part of these improvement plans, as APR really is an institutional effort. Student athletes are an integral part of the student population. If you're interested in your APR rates and you do not currently know what they are, all APR rates for the schools are publicly available on the NCAA website. They are listed by school, and you can actually also search them by a head coach in the head coach's portfolio. Now for the GSR. GSR is graduation success rate. If you're in Division II, you'll actually hear the term ASR, which is academic success rate. Very similar rate that is being looked at Division II. GSR was developed in response to the college and university presidents who wanted a more accurate graduation rate to actually reflect the mobility among college students today, students transferring in and out, those types of things. So the GSR for athletics actually supplements, it does not replace the federal rate. The GSR, as I just mentioned, discounts transfers out who leave eligible because they are dropped out of that cohort, but the GSR does account for those who transfer in. The other thing GSR accounts for that the federal rate doesn't would be mid-year enrollees and other incoming transfers. With those students either discounted or accounted for in the cohort, the GSR therefore is a more accurate reflection of what is really happening with the graduation success, because it takes into account that there are students that are still graduating after they transfer or after they enter mid-year, etc. Regardless of which rate is used, whether it's a federal one or the graduation success rate, as Adrian mentioned earlier, overall student athletes are shown to graduate at a higher rate than their peers in the general student body. Similar to APR, the GSR and federal rates are published on the NCAA website, and those rates are available for Division I, II, and III by sport, by conference, and by year. Other thing, beyond knowing the rules, beyond knowing about APP, in order to help student athletes best, it's important for advisors to know some of the hot topics that are going on in the world of athletics. A couple of those hot topics that directly affect academics are time demands and academic integrity. We hear all the time about the amount of time that student athletes are spending on their sports, and that can be practice, conditioning, film review, team meetings, pregame activities, academic meetings, study halls, tutors, student development activities like career development, personal development, community service. They could be meeting with the media. They could be doing promotional activities. They may be competing either home or away, and obviously while they're going away, they're traveling. The list seems to be endless of the demands that are on student athletes. So just very recently, in the spring of 2016, the NCAA conducted a survey of the Division I membership. And as a result of that survey, over 44,000 responses were received from Division I student athletes. Plus over 3,000 head coaches and over 2,000 athletic administrators completed that survey. Looking at that survey, the NCAA management is now considering a couple of different things to address time demands. First and foremost, they're trying to define what is a countable activity. The word countable is kind of an NCAA term. What actually counts towards the 20 hours a week that student athletes are actually doing their sport. And so certain things, academic meetings don't count. Practice time does count. Voluntary workouts don't count. So there's a kind of a lot of decision being made on what will and won't be defined as countable. Other possible changes are to the competition season themselves, possibly reducing competitions. Maybe actually lengthening the season, not necessarily increasing competitions, but lengthening the season so that it's stretched out over a longer period of time. Men's soccer in particular is interested in possibly moving into a two-season mode, so they would split fall and spring, so fewer competitions but have competitions both semesters. Also looking at should midweek games exist. Those types of changes in the competition season are being looked at. Looking at breaks during the season, looking at breaks over things like winter break and spring breaks, looking at what happens the day of competition. The competition may be at 7 o'clock at night, but oftentimes student athletes are busy from 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon on for those pregame activities. Looking at postseason breaks. That once the season ends, should the student athletes have a break? I think often campus advisors are not aware. They think, oh, the season's over, that the student athlete is done. But the reality is student athletes are pretty much going year round. And as soon as the season ends, they're already doing conditioning and preparing for the next season. Looking at days off, right now it's 1 day a week. Should they have more than 1 day a week off? I know myself personally, I sure appreciate weekends off when I have them, and I think we all know we look forward to those like 3-day weekends and having more than 1 day off a week. Looking at limiting competitions during exams. Certain conferences actually have limitations where competition cannot happen during exams, but not all conferences have that rule. One thing that I'm pretty excited about that I think advisors should be aware, and it's not yet final, but they're looking at actually pausing eligibility so that student athletes can compete or can participate in study abroad opportunities or internships. Right now, it's very hard for a student athlete to go overseas, do a study abroad, or to do an internship at a company somewhere when they have to travel with their sport and compete and practice. So pausing eligibility for study abroad internships is something being considered as a result of this. Travel days off. Right now, travel day is not necessarily considered a day off. Student athletes would like to see that travel day be considered a day off. And then some other things being looked at are just that after a travel period that there have to be at least so many hours before the student athlete has to be ready to go with their next conditioning or workout or whatever the case may be. There's definitely more to come on these time demands. So I think, again, with competency, please pay attention to what's happening with that, because that will help when you're working with student athletes in terms of advising and working on graduation plans, etc. The other real big hot topic in academics right now is academic integrity. Academic integrity is definitely something that everyone should be concerned about, and advisors need to understand their role in monitoring student athlete academic integrity. I think, the reason academic integrity is probably on everyone's radar right now, you can turn on the TV, Sports Center, ESPN along the ticker, and you'll hear about several schools that had some issues lately. UNC is probably the most prominent one, North Carolina. You've heard of Syracuse and a few others. But it's only been it's only been recently that the NCAA kind of started to revisit the existing national framework. It was in 1983 that the last legislative update to the existing national framework actually occurred from the NCAA. But now with these schools, rather prominent schools out there with the media and congressional attention, the NCAA has realized that there's been a lack of clarity and consistency in their approach. With the former legislative approach not requiring institutions maintain policies to deal with academic misconduct issues, the NCAA is now requiring that so that there will not be that perceived lack of consistency in how the legislation is applied. The new legislation, therefore, does require that your institution either maintain and or establish a written academic misconduct policy that's applicable to the general student body. Most schools have that, but they really need to look to make sure that it's in writing and that that the scope and the content of that policy is going to be sufficient for what the NCAA is looking for. The policies must be applied equally and consistently to student athletes and non-student athletes. However, it is possible in those policies to have an expedited review process for student athletes. As advisors, it's important that you review your institutional policies and procedures. There's so many things to consider, everything from your testing procedures, proctoring exams, online exam testing, placement exam testing, how are extra credit protocols, how does that happen in various classes. Tutoring. For example, at Chicago State, we're a small, limited resource Division I school, and our tutoring does not take place in athletics. So ours is through our Learning Assistance Center on campus. So it's important that we're coordinating with those staff members that work on the tutoring protocols at Chicago State. Grade changes. How do grade changes happen? Who controls that? What's the process? That's important to know that information. Oftentimes advisors are part of a grade change process, so you need to make sure that when you're doing that, you're following the proper procedures and protocols. You need to look at who's the independent decision-making authority. You know, can an advisor make a decision to do something like waive a course requirement or substitute a class? And if an advisor is doing that, does it fit within the academic policies of the institution? So again, it's very, very important to review your institution policies and procedures. Make sure that you've established the necessary protocols, you know, who's communicating what to whom and how they're communicating it. And then make sure that you're continually educating yourself, your staff, and even others, up to including boosters when that's appropriate. Now, there's a lot that we kind of covered pretty quickly in the competency, and certainly we don't expect anyone to be an expert. As I mentioned, I've been doing this over 20 years, and the rules change and they get updated, so it's important that you keep abreast of them and make sure you know what your resources are that are available. The NCAA manual, you see a picture of it there. It looks nice and flat. It's actually a little over an inch thick, full of all kinds of exciting rules and regulations, but you can download that for an electronic version for free on ncaa.org. I'd also suggest that if you are able to get to the NCAA regional rules seminars, those are free to NCAA members to attend those, and they do break them down Division I, Division II, and Division III sessions, so you can go to the appropriate sessions. Also, the N4A, National Association of Academic Advisors for Athletics, and NACADA, both normally have sessions where the NCAA actually comes in and conducts sessions with the members there at those sessions to cover some of these rules and regulations. On campus, make sure you know who your academic advisors are in athletics, faculty athletic rep. Every campus has a faculty athletic rep who should be a great resource of some of this information. And then I would also add that your compliance personnel in athletics would also be a great resource. I think the key thing here with competency is that you're networking with people and participating and keeping abreast of things. Networking is going to be key so that you have the resources to turn to for assistance. Moving on, we've talked a lot about the things you need to know, but let's also talk about how you communicate that information. So from competency, we're going to move on to communication, and the first skill that we're going to talk about is listening. Good communication, of course, requires both listening as well as talking, but you'll often hear the expression that you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, meaning that you probably need to listen much more than you actually talk. So in communication, it's important that you don't interrupt, that you really are actively listening. Everybody thinks and speaks at different rates, but the burden is on you to make sure that you're listening, and if necessary, you may need to relax your pace so that you can be a more thoughtful communicator. Informing. A big part of communication is making sure you are able to transfer ideas, to express and exchange information. You have to consider the various ways to do that, to inform. You can do it in writing, you can do it in text, you can do it in email. I'm sure you can you do it in person. There's all kinds of ways to make sure you're informing others. But it's important that you understand the environment in which you are going to inform someone. There's a time and a place for everything when you're relaying information. Engaging, you have to engage the student athletes when you're speaking with them. You have to be present. We know it's really hard. You're busy. You're in the midst of an email. You're typing an email. A student walks in, and you're trying to finish that, but yet you know you need to be present for that student. It is very, very important that you give that attention and that you pay attention. When you're having the conversation and you're engaging someone, make sure you know what the key points are and that you stick with them. You have to screen out any distractions that may exist, no matter how hard that may be in today's high-tech society. Obviously we all got cell phones beeping and buzzing and all kinds of things going around. So do your best to screen out those distractions so that you can be engaged, and that will help others to be engaged. And then don't forget about group settings. In group settings, it can be even harder to engage because now you've got a group of people to engage, but always consider the space that you're working in, everything from the acoustics in the room to the temperature in the room, etc. Respect. in communication, I just can't express enough how important respect is. If you're not given respect, you're not going to get respect. We all seem to know that. But you've really got to make sure that you're respecting the person as an individual. Don't focus on things like their accent, their speech, their mannerisms, and don't be distracted by your own biases and feelings. We all have those students that maybe don't speak English as well as we'd like them to speak it, or maybe they're an international student and they've got some kind of accent, but you still need to respect the conversation and what they're trying to tell you. So, there's no need to judge or mentally criticize the things that someone may be telling you. Make sure that you're taking into account any diversity or differences that may exist. As I mentioned, international students, for example, eye contact in some cultures may be very unsettling. So be aware of those things and respect those people. Accountability. When you're communicating, you have to be accountable. And how do you become accountable? With accountability, you have to establish expectations. What are the goals? What are the expectations? Establishing those on the front end are extremely important. If you don't establish them on the front end, it's very hard to expect that accountability. So always say what you mean and mean what you say. And just remember to sustain the accountability, follow up with people. Make sure you provide them guidance and feedback. When a student athlete does something well, make sure that you reward them for that good work. And then on the opposite hand, constructive feedback when maybe there has been some poor performance, but make sure that everyone's held accountable. Responsibility. You have to be responsible for your communication. Have you ever kind of walked away from a conversation and kind of shook your head and said, why don't they get it? I don't understand why they didn't get it. And we have to recognize failure to communicate is a fact of everyday life. I didn't see the email, I didn't get the message, nobody told me, or the infamous, I didn't get the memo. So think about what you say and how you say it, because the sender of the message is always the one responsible for whether or not the message was received. Be aware of your role and be responsible for performing that role and the results you get in that role. Taking responsibilities for your results is the fastest way to improve your communication effectiveness because it empowers you to find solutions for your challenges. It also empowers you to find ways to take advantage of your greatest opportunities. Availability is the last one we're going to talk here about communication. Being available. It's really hard to communicate when you're not available to do so. It sounds pretty simple, but the key to effective communication is making sure that you're available so that you are meeting the needs of others. We all provide students services, and we all know that it can be tough to meet all of their needs, but we have to try to provide those services depending on what their needs are. In the case of student athletes, they may vary from the general student population. Here on our campus, we actually, I'm on a retention committee, and we actually did a log of contracts in our first year experience, and it showed that the students were actually not seeking out the advisors between 8 a.m. and 11 a.m. in the morning. And so the first year experience had to adjust their hours to better serve the students later in the day, evening hours, drop-in hours, things like that. Those are things that will also be very helpful with student athletes, making sure you're available for them. Drop-in hours, evening hours, online advising, just being willing to pick up the phone and call a student athlete while they're traveling somewhere. Even in some cases, actually going to the location where student athletes are. At a past institution, had advisors made themselves available by actually coming over and working out of our offices during peak times like registration. And then even, with social media that's available in this day and age, using social media to be available to help advise students. And if you think about the different technologies that are available, you'll see here on the screen, there are many of them, and I think if you look at those, they're easily identifiable. They're certainly identifiable to the millennials of today, but we've got Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, LinkedIn. There's plenty others, YouTube, Google+, Skype, text messaging, FaceTime, and all kinds of other apps. Probably the younger people on this webinar know more than me, but the technology available is just incredible. Some of the technology you see on there, Grades First. Often schools are using Grades First, but definitely a lot of, particularly Division I schools are using Grades First. It's a retention software that helps to manage everything from study hall to tutor appointments to advising sessions to book lists to travel letters, all of the different needs that student athletes may have. And then the TW you see there, if you're not familiar with that, again, highly Division I software that's being purchased. It is a collaborative platform that athletic departments are using that connects the whole athletic department, allowing a common way for all of athletics coaches, administrators, students, trainers, sports information to communicate and share information. For your school, you need to identify which of those platforms work best for your students, but I think the important thing is that you're using those technologies to meet the student athletes where they are. Got to use it effectively, but at the same time, let's always make sure that we're taking into account personal boundaries, security issues, things like that. Because social media can be a big help. It's accessible, it's convenient, it's very cost effective. It helps everyone to be more proactive and efficient. And when we're more proactive and efficient, we will all see many more ways in which our student athletes will be successful. And in fact, now Adrienne is going to address some of the specifics of that shared success.
Thank you, Karen. Every effort should be made to find ways to include the entire university community as a support system for student athletes, so regardless of your position on campus. We have a shared goal of student success, so collaboration between athletic academic support and traditional advisors is key to the academic success of student athletes. It doesn't benefit the students for us to not communicate well, so the more people caring and checking on student athletes, the better. So a couple best practices for enhancing that collaboration between traditional academic advisors and our advisors in athletics. Karen spoke a little bit about non-traditional advising times. So for some of the traditional advisors, if there's a way that you're able to offer academic advising in a non-traditional way, that might be a way to deal with some of those time demands and the time issues and time management issues that student athletes are facing. One of the things that we've done on our campus here at Marquette is that some advisors have an alternate advising week. And it's for any student who's having a challenge with meeting during that traditional advising week. There might be appointments at night, like Karen mentioned, online advising, all good ways to meet student athletes' time needs, but then any student who's experiencing some time difficulties. Another best practice is to invite athletic academic support personnel to maybe your staff meetings. As you get together and you talk about new programs, new policies, new degree requirements, it might be especially helpful to have someone from academic support and athletics to attend some of these meetings who might be able to then give you some of the student athlete perspective and how some of these new policies, procedures might impact student athletes. On our campus, we formed a group called CAPS. And what that does is it brings all advisors together across campus, whether you're a traditional advisor or you're advising in one of our specialized programs, such as like our Educational Opportunity Program or our Urban Scholars Program, all are at the table together. And it just creates a great opportunity for us to discuss what's happening with students in general. And then because I'm there as a seat representing intercollegiate athletics, that voice of student athletes, again, is represented. And so people get to hear multiple perspectives on issues. Another way that traditional advisors can bridge that gap between advisors on campus is to celebrate academic and athletic success with everyone. So invite athletic academic advisors to celebrate some of the academic achievements of student athletes. So for example, if you're having an honors program, an induction ceremony, or some type of recognition program, it might be great to invite athletic academic advisors because it can demonstrate some of that shared responsibility and support. Some best practices for those who are working in athletics is to talk with advisors so that you're able to talk with traditional advisors so that you're able to understand some of their questions, their concerns, and maybe some of their frustrations with student athletes. I think about issues sometimes related to classes, and it's great to just lay out, hey, this is the practice time. This is why that student athlete can't take that course, and to get that out in the open, and it improves communication. It also might be good to invite academic advisors to some of your programs in athletics. We host every year a fall open house, and it creates a great way for us to be transparent about our services that we offer and then to connect with advisors across campus in our own space. They can come over, see the space, understand what our role is in advising student athletes. Another way is to do more community outreach. So often we'll do workshops across campus. We might host NCAA rule workshops with our compliance director. We might go to like our new faculty orientation on campus. Our campus has what we call GROW seminars. They're just educational seminars on campus, and we try and host one of those each year so that we're able to educate everyone on campus about kind of what goes on in athletics and what the student-athlete experience is. I always say participating in some of these outreach activities helps you build a network of support for student-athletes. It's more people than on campus who understand athletics and who are willing to advocate for student-athletes. Here are some resources available so that you might find out a little bit more about advising student-athletes. Karen mentioned earlier the National Association of Academic Advisors for Athletics. It's a group of professionals who are dedicated to advising student-athletes. They also produce some really great documents available on their resource. One of them is the N4A Best Practices for Promoting and Maintaining a Culture of Student-Athlete Success, Accountability, and Academic Integrity. So if you have an opportunity, check that out. Also, the NCAA website can offer more in-depth rules knowledge. Also, you can get more about Division II and Division III athletics and the overall student-athlete experience. And then some of the other websites and associations that might provide more information. Last points, remember we mentioned earlier in the webinar presentation the Academic Success in the Student-Athlete online course sponsored by NACADA. This is an 8-week course designed to provide an avenue for staff members who are working with athletes to gain more information on the basics of advising student-athletes. We put an emphasis on improving academic success and then NCAA rules and regulation knowledge. And then Jackie can talk a little bit more about the Advising Student-Athlete Commission and their role.
Okay. The mission of the commission is to share ideas and best practices for those who work with student-athletes, not only in their advising population, but those who work solely with student-athletes as well. We have members from Division I, Division II, Division III, NAIA, junior colleges, and Canadian institutions as part of the current commission. If that is something that you're interested in learning more about, please feel free to reach out to me. At the end of this webinar, I will definitely get you involved with the commission and provide you with a little bit more information. And at this time, I'd like to thank both Karen and Adrian for serving as our panelists for today's discussion. And I would like to move on to the question and answer section of this webinar. And we have a couple of questions that are out there already, and I will ask both the ladies to answer them. And the first one would be is, how does the NCAA evaluate NCAA rules on students with 2 majors? Is the second major considered or only the primary major?
Do you want me to go first?
Go ahead, Karen.
Since I had to cover the rules, which is like the, in terms of, and I'm speaking again specifically for Division I, but when a student has a double major or 2 majors, it is always whatever is listed as their primary major. So whatever is considered the primary major is how you're basing their eligibility on their primary major. Not to get too much into the weeds, but sometimes what has to happen is each semester the student-athlete has to actually kind of change which their primary major is in order to make sure that they're meeting those eligibility requirements. But it's always the primary major that you're basing eligibility on.
Thank you. The next question we would have is, if a student-athlete has their semester interrupted by a concussion, what tips do you have for them returning to their school?
So I know on our campus, one of the things that I suggest any campus to, if you haven't done, to do now is to create a return to learn policy for any students on campus who might have their learning impacted by a concussion. And we work a lot with our Office of Disability Services, with our health center on campus to create what that return to learn protocol looks like, so that any student on campus follows that protocol. But specifically in athletics, I always say if you have campus support professionals who are dedicated to just athletics, work with them. If you can do it as a collaborative process, it makes it easier so that you're not duplicating services and that you're able to support students in their getting back to learning.
I would just add that the Power 5 conferences actually have a requirement for a concussion protocol that needs to be followed. Often the non-Power 5 schools are actually opting into that legislation. So there's some very strict rules and regulations regarding concussions, since they are such a student-athlete welfare health issue.
Thank you. Next question we have for you is, how can we streamline communication between academic advisors, athletic advisors, and coaching staff?
You go first. I'll go first on that one. It may depend on the institution that you're at, I will say that. And again, strictly speaking from Division I, most Division I schools will actually have some level of directive or policy that actually precludes coaches from speaking with academic advisors or other campus personnel like faculty, admissions, registrar, those types of staff. So in the case of Division I, that's where you should rely on your athletic academic advisors in Division I to help make sure that communication is happening. For smaller schools where the coach may actually be the advisor, things like that, again, kind of back to some of the things we talked about with communication, I think it's very important that everyone's being accountable and responsible for their role. Everyone's doing everything with integrity. And, you know, I'm always going to say that when there is a situation or a challenge, to me, sometimes the best thing to do is to have that face-to-face communication and not do the emails and not do those, you know, text messages. I think sitting down face-to-face, getting everybody in the same room to help with the situation normally is the best way to go.
All right, thank you. I think we have time for about one more question. And the last one is, we are a small school with a limited money provided for professional development for our advising staff. What is the best thing we can learn more about our student athletes without attending an expensive conference?
Well, this is where I feel like I definitely want to plug the summer online course. It does stretch out for 8 weeks, so it does give you an opportunity to learn more about advising student athletes over an extended period of time. That opportunity to connect with NCAA professionals through that course. There's office hours with each of the facilitators. It gives you a chance to ask more questions about some of the specificities of your campus. So if you are that smaller campus and you don't have athletic academic advisors, it gives you as an advisor a great opportunity to ask questions that directly impact you, your student population. So take that course and then also use these websites as references. It's excellent resources that we've put here. Each of these websites, whether it's the NCAA website or the NAIA, has lots of information that's available to you. The NCAA website even has some free stuff that's out there, some other free conferences for you to attend. So that might be something to consider.
And then I will just volunteer Adrian and Jackie. If you have any questions, just call them at any point in time. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they are available.
Okay, and we're going to go on one last question. What advice do you have for academic advisors working with students who want to pursue intense and time-consuming degrees that are complicated by their competition schedules, class schedules, practice times, for example, student teaching or nursing practicum?
This is difficult. It's always a difficult question because the students actually sometimes may have to make a decision. I think that is one of the things to be very clear and upfront with the student athlete. Certain majors that are very rigorous may conflict with athletic schedules. So I think having those conversations as proactively as possible from the beginning is the first step, and being very upfront and very clear and providing the information about what that means. And you've got to work closely with those student athletes to develop, and I'd say no pun intended, but a game plan. What is the game plan? What are they going to take each semester? Can we do things through summer school? What are the various options to get this particular degree? That means that the advisor on campus for that major, that means the athletic advisor, that means the student. Everyone needs to be involved in that conversation. And the reality is that there may have to be a situation where the student may potentially be in another major, but then through graduate programs or other experiences can actually achieve the goals that they're trying to reach. So sometimes you have to think a little bit outside the box as well.
Yeah, I would just second that. There's sometimes you have to come up with, again, non-traditional ways to help the student. For us on our campus, it's meant that, you know, the team might travel one day and a student athlete might travel separately the next day. An assistant coach might have to stay back and drive a van in order for a student to be able to attend a lab, to be able to take an exam. So it's really everyone working collaboratively to try and support that student in them being able to be in that major.
All right. And that is our last question from our question and answer section. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to our two presenters, Karen and Adrian, or myself, and we'll be more than willing to assist you. Again, thank you, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you.